What's up, Archons? I'm Flightless Pheasant, and now that you're here, we should talk about the little green elephant in the room. Oh, but don't worry, my new headgear will keep them from reading our thoughts. But before we do, I'm a huge fan of Keyforge, and if you are too, then please like, subscribe, and hit the bell, as I'll be bringing you even more lore from Keyforge and the Crucible. Ah! Apologies, loyal viewer. Please excuse the interruption. I will now begin another installment of Houses of the Crucible, a series where I break down one of the houses that is part of the Keyforge lore. Each house is unique, but Mars is superior. These houses all work together with Archons to forge keys, open vaults, and loot the treasures inside. They all bring with them their unique design inspirations, ideals, hierarchies, membership requirements, technology, and uses for amber. In this series, we break it all down so that you too can appreciate this wonderfully conquerable world that is the Crucible. Well, that was an experience. Well, in case you haven't guessed already, today we're going to be doing House Mars. The design inspirations for House Mars draw heavily upon things like War of the Worlds, Independence Day, and Mars Attacks, and various other space invasion movies, TV shows, and comic books. Because this is their primary inspiration, they have a number of unique mechanics that center around this kind of idea of them being alien invaders. The most iconic mechanic of Mars that represents this is the abduction mechanic, which is basically just a mechanic by which you can take one of your opponent's creatures and put it into your own archives, thereby abducting it and keeping it trapped until you're ready to pick up your own archives at some later point, which would normally then return that card to your opponent's hand, still keeping it out of play. Mars does also have a number of ray guns and spaceships and other motifs very common to these space invasion themes of media, and even their appearance as little green men is a very classic homage to the pieces of media from which their inspiration is drawn. Membership of House Mars is made up exclusively of Martians, green-skinned, bulbous-headed, gangly-limbed alien creatures, with two distinct morphologies. First is the Martian soldier. Smaller and stockier than the other morphology, the Martian soldier does the bulk of the fighting for Mars. They're also often employed as scouts or spies. Second is the Martian elder. These are taller, ganglier Martians who primarily fill scientific and leadership roles within the Martian society. There are also a number of Martian native creatures that are employed by House Mars, but these are less members and more like war machines or pets. The hierarchy of House Mars is incredibly rigid. Or it was until a recent rebellion, but we'll get to that in a minute. Typically speaking, House Mars has a very strict hierarchy by which the soldiers, who are vat-bred and cloned, are the subservient to the Martian elders. The soldiers are not encouraged to have independent thought or ideas, and are brainwashed by various chemicals and propaganda into following the directions of the Martian elders without question. The elders, on the other hand, are given wide range to do as they wish, so long as it is in service of Mars. So many of them become researchers, scientists, ambassadors, or other leadership roles that they take over the various soldiers in their domain. This hierarchy is so rigid that many of the things that the soldiers do in their life is designed to keep them down. From consuming propaganda to genuine brainwashing, all the way down to the preferred currency of Mars. Known as a ferrum, this three-sided coin is actively radioactive, so that the soldiers of Mars won't hoard the currency and become wealthy, or if they do, they'll die of radiation poisoning. It's worth noting that most Martian elders actually don't use ferrums themselves and are perfectly fine using ambits, the more common currency of the Crucible. Mars has yet to announce a proper leader in any of the sets so far, but I would like to put forward a couple of candidates. Meet Tallest Red and Tallest Purple from Invader Zim. Yeah, I know, but go with me on this. House Mars has already shown that height equals power, at least in some ways, as there are multiple cards with flavor text that mention that being taller is better. Mix the Tall-Minded is being the primary example of this. So I hypothesize that when we do eventually get a leader for House Mars, it will probably be some kind of Martian elder who's known for being taller than anyone else. It might even just be a title, like the tallest. So I mentioned that this hierarchy is normally very rigid, but recently, during the Winds of Exchange set, a group of soldiers decided that they were no longer interested in doing as they were told, and began a revolution. Under the banner of Ironics, Borka Rick gathered together a bunch of other Martian soldiers and created his own enclave, known as the Ironics Enclave, that waged war against the more traditionalist elements of the Martian society. While this rebellion was not entirely successful, they did manage to establish their own separate enclave. It is worth noting that while this enclave does stand in opposition to the traditional Martian society, they're still pretty Mars first, and don't really interact with most of the other elements of the Crucible whenever possible. But still, it's interesting to note such a large-scale revolution against the established Martian hierarchy, and that they weren't unsuccessful and do still exist moving forward into future sets. In fact, even though he didn't get the leader trait, you could argue that Borka Rick deserves such a title, as he is leading his own Martian enclave, even if it's not the entirety of House Mars. And especially since the Witch Queen and Eldest Bear tell us that you can have multiple leaders in the same house, I'd like to think that it's totally reasonable for Borka Rick to take that title alongside whoever leads the more traditionalist elements of Mars. Much of the influence that House Mars holds is due to the fact that some 200 years ago, an entire chunk of the Red Planet was all brought to the Crucible together in one singular event. This area of the Crucible is now known as Nova Hellas, and is the center of power for all of the Martian enclaves. In this event, 3 cities, as well as wide swaths of territory, including mining facilities, weapons manufacturing, and more, were all brought to the Crucible together. This means that much of the Martian society was easily maintained through the transfer. Initially, the Martians were stymied somewhat by the Crucible's lack of cavorite, which was the radioactive material that they used to power their various weapons and machines, but they did learn that they could use alternative power sources, primarily amber. Their society is predicated on the assumption that Mars is superior to all others, and they bring this energy to everything they do. They try very desperately to conquer the Crucible, as they believe it is their birthright to do so. But their success rate so far has been more miss than hit, as they seem to have a hard time getting organized on a large enough scale, particularly since the Elders have dived into their own individual researches more than they have into the conquest of the Crucible. Nevertheless, they all believe that someday their inevitable victory will be achieved, if only they could figure out some way to get their preferred invasion strategy to work. Normally, when Mars invades a new world, they do it from space, with their spaceships blasting huge ray guns from the atmosphere to wipe out large swaths of the enemy territory. But the Crucible won't let them do that, as the boundary that separates the atmosphere from space is impassable by even their most advanced of saucers. House Mars does have a number of unique technologies, many of which were transported with them when Nova Hellas was brought to the Crucible. The most signature of these obviously being their flying saucers and ray guns, but they do also have a number of advanced robots and implants for brain controlling and hypnosis beams and invasion portals and various other bits of technology that are highly impressive. However, it's worth noting that the scientists of House Mars have very little interest in advancing new technologies that they might discover on the Crucible, and instead have been working hard to recreate their own technology from the heyday of their empire. This backwards-looking effect has somewhat limited their creations. However, they were able to make one major advancement, and that was the discovery of a huge amber deposit inside the boundaries of Nova Hellas. Above this amber deposit, they built the Crystal Hive, a large city mine structure that they used to pull the amber out of the ground, meaning that House Mars has a monopoly on one of the largest known amber deposits in the local group, giving them unfettered, unique access to large quantities of the substance. In spite of having access to large quantities of amber, House Mars has done very little unique with it, as they are insistent on maintaining their old Cavorite-driven technology, and since amber isn't Cavorite, it has a hard time interacting with this technology and frequently ends up irradiated and discarded since the technology is largely incompatible. It also means that they put a huge amount of effort into trying to retrofit it to fit in with their other devices. There is, however, one unique use for amber that they have been able to pioneer, though the Martian elders are very nervous about the implications of this particular application. They've learned that Martians have a particular propensity towards psychic abilities when channeled through amber. While this is fascinating to many of the Martian elders, they are also terrified that if this knowledge were to get out, the Martian soldiers might learn that they too have this psychic propensity and use their new powers to overthrow their elders. A fear that I'm sure has been largely justified by the recent Ironics Revolution. When talking about House Mars' relationship with the other houses of the Crucible, it's important to make one clear distinction. That is between House Mars and Martians. An individual Martian might find its way into the society of the other houses of the Crucible quite easily, and actually do so with regular frequency. However, these Martians are outcasts who are deemed heretical by Martian society, and are hunted down at every opportunity, which, ironically, makes them more likely to work with other houses, as being pursued by their own house is incredibly dangerous if they don't have assistance in order to hide or find protection. Because of this, you will find individual Martians in other houses, like House Star Alliance, or working together with House Geistoid. But House Mars itself is incredibly antagonistic to all of the other forces on the Crucible, barring the occasional Archon, with whom they will work for their own benefit by gaining power from whatever they get out of the deal with that Archon. And during those times, they will, temporarily, work with other houses, but only under the supervision of said Archon. House Mars has a really bad reputation that's well earned. They also frequently send out spies and other intelligence gathering apparatuses to pretend to be outcasts in order to find the secret hidden plans of how other houses are going to annihilate House Mars. That no such plans tend to exist just makes them even more determined in their attempts to discover them. I really enjoy the lore of House Mars. It's incredibly dense and interesting, and because they've brought so much of their society with them, they sort of cling to their past in a way that most of the other houses have kind of given up on, and they look backward instead of forward. I think that's sort of indicative of their xenophobic and Mars-centric way of looking at the world. But no matter how you split it, they're incredibly interesting, even more so after the recent Ironics Revolution. I hope you really enjoyed this deep dive into House Mars and learned some new things that you can take along to your next game. Come along with me next time as we explore one of the bright holds of the grand and glorious protectors of the Crucible, House Sanctum, who will gladly offer their shield to anyone who acknowledges the purity and sanctity of Amber. Until next time, I'm Flightless Pheasant, and this has been Houses of the Crucible Mars. Later, Archons.